Welcome to another episode of the Svarim Chatter podcast. I'm Nachi Weinstein. This episode of the podcast is sponsored in honor of Rabbi Elchanan Adler and his steadfast commitment to his Talmidim by Talmidim of Rabbi Adler. To sponsor an episode of the podcast or to support the podcast, you can email me svarimchatter@gmail.com or check out the information and links in the show notes. You can also find a link in the show notes to join the Svarim Chatter WhatsApp community where I post new Svarim, new books, and book deals, and so on. If you can also subscribe and rate and review the podcast wherever it is that you listen, whether that's Apple or 24/6 or Spotify, it's appreciated. And if anyone has any feedback on the podcast about any of the episodes, or if you would like to offer a guest or topic suggestion, you can email me svarimchatter@gmail.com, or if you're on the WhatsApp, you can message me on WhatsApp. And with that, enjoy the episode. Hi, everyone. Welcome to another edition of the Svarim Chatter podcast. And on this episode of the podcast, I'm going to be joined once again by Rabbi Elchanan Adler, who's Rosh Yeshiva in Reitz, and he's a Mechaber Sefer of a number of Svarim. We previously discussed his Animus Miras, which is in English and Hebrew. He also has Haggadah and a number of other Svarim, including what we're going to be discussing on this episode, which is a new edition of his, or really the first time it's been available for for sale to the general public, and it's in hardcover now. Beautiful Sefer, Elchanan. It's Biyurim on Tfilas Mussaf of Shabbos. It also includes in the back of it the Kuntris Tam Mussaf Tikanta Shabbos, which is a Yosef of Akayin of Corfu from a few hundred years ago. It's redone with introduction, a beautiful sefer in itself, and it's a small sefer, so that's included in the back here. We'll talk about that as well. Also, I say a new edition because previously there was a paperback of this. There's also from Mosaic Press a few years ago an English edition of this called the Mussaf Prayer. We'll discuss how this edition differs from that, and we'll get into that. But thank you, Rabbi Adler, for joining me once again.
It's my pleasure, Nachi. Thank you for having me.
So previously, we discussed your background. The first question I asked, usually we discussed that on the previous episode we did on Animus Miras, and anyone interested in Animus Miras should listen to that episode. But I do want to start off, now that you publish a sefer on Animus Miras in English and Hebrew, this is basically your third edition. You kind of expanded and revised and very different of a sefer on Mussaf of Shabbos. How did you become interested in tefillah and biurei tefillah? And this is something that, you're a Shiva and you regularly give shir, a regular masech. This is not your day job, so to speak. So how did you become so interested that you're writing and publishing svarim on tefillah?
Thank you. It's a very good question. My greatest source of nachas really is what I do pretty much every day, and that's, giving shir, current Talmidim, past Talmidim, and the real nachas is to see true B'nai Torah who are Mekadeshim Shemaim, whatever their particular path that they take in life, Avodas HaKodesh or other professions. But meanwhile, about myself and how I got interested in tefillah. So I grew up on the Lower East Side. I went to MTJ as a youngster. My father, Zechron Avracha, was a close Talmud of Moshe Feinstein. So that's how the family kept up a connection with the Feinstein Mishpacha and MTJ. I went to high school in the Mir Yeshiva in Brooklyn. I learned by Rav David Kviat, Ariel Yukansky, Shmuel Birnbaum, and Yibadul Chaim, Rav Eli Budny. I was in the Vardik in Beis Yosef. Rav Yaakov Yafin was my Masada Kedushin, and Rav Mordechai Yafin Zatzal was Rosh Kollel then. And then I came to YU. I learned in the Bris Kol Elyon in Reitz and was a Shalom Meshiv. And then I started giving a shir about 26 years ago. Throughout this time, I always had a side interest in tefillah. And, in recent years, as you mentioned, I was able to write a number of svarim, several of which had to do with bir tefillah. So, Nusach HaTefillah has roots, as we all know, in Psukim and Tanakh. And ever since I was young, I was always curious about where certain psukim came from, certain phrases came from. Let's say you see Hodu, and you see the phrases that strung together. So it's not just Divrei Yamim, then you get to Tehillim, Yehi Chabad Hashem La'olam. Where's each pasuk come from? Slichas, the beginning of Slichas. You have all different psukim from Tehillim, different places strung together. It's not one entity. I was thinking, for example, Osa Shalom ben Romav. We say it at the end of Kaddish, the end of Shemona Esrei. How many people know where those words come from? Iyov, Kapitel Chafhei. When I was a teenager, and I would be Mavis Sedra with Rashi. So Rashi would quote an obscure pasuk in Tanakh to prove the meaning of a word. So I told my Talmidim, I'm not ashamed to say, I would literally take, a Tanakh, and every time Rashi would quote some obscure pasuk, I wanted to know, where's this pasuk? And I'd look at Rashi on the pasuk, I'd look at other Mefarshim on the pasuk to get the context of the pasuk. I do this with what we do with Tosfos and Shir. Tosfos quotes the Gemara, so track it, look at the Gemara inside. So this was dabbling in my mind with Nusach HaTfilah without any formal exposure to any Svarim that were devoted to the topic. Okay, fast forward. After I got married, a few years after I got married, we moved to Passaic. So I was invited by Rav Yonason Sachs to give a weekly shiur in the Aguda Passaic. He let me choose the topic. So I decided, I always have this fancy, feeling about Nusach HaTfilah. Let me feed that interest. So I began to give shiur on the Shabbos davening, starting with Kabbalah Shabbos. This went on for several years. I'd do a series of maybe 6 or 8 shiurim, take a little break, and then resume where we left off. When I started doing that, this is probably about 20-some years ago, so then I began to discover the wealth of material available on the topic of tefillah. This is before the days of Otzar HaChachma, which now we have so much readily available. So I started with the classic Svarim, the Rishonim, the Abu Dram, Rabbi Yakar, and it was helped by other Svarim. The Sibina is a classic example of a sefer that came out many years ago on tefillah. And when I had to find something that wasn't so well known, so I would go to the library, Mendel Geisman Library at YU, and broaden my perspective. Over those years, I was able to give shiurim starting with Kabbalah Shabbos all the way, including Shabbos Mincha. So I literally went through Friday night davening, Shabbos morning davening, Yikum Purka, Navarachamim, Birchas HaChodesh, Mussaf, Enkel Elokeinu, Pitam Aktoras, Yisamani Aktoras, Shir Shel Yom, you name it, and then Mincha. I collected a lot of material from those shiurim, but I never really did anything systematically with it. I wrote an article here and there for Jewish Action, for Tradition. At some point, a couple of years ago, I decided to go back over the material, and I had to obviously figure out how do I publish it. So you have to supplement it. You can't go with notes from 20 years ago, 15 years ago, and beginning to look at what you have now. The Malzivitri used to be an edition that was Horovitz came out. That was the old Malzivitri. Now you have the Goldschmidt edition. Shiboy Aleket came out with a new edition, Otzar HaChachma. To make a long story short, so I started with a small kuntris on Birkas HaChodesh. I don't know if you have it now, you have to get it to you, called Yerach Tov. So Yerach Tov originally came out in a small kuntris on Birkas HaChodesh, and then it was also done in English by OU Press. For my son's bar mitzvah, this was about 7 years ago, I put out a kuntris on his Niros in Lashon HaKodesh, Tzvi Tifara, and then we had that put out in English, as you mentioned before, by Feldheim. Then came 2016, this sefer Elchanan that we're going to talk about now, on Shabbos Mussaf. So that was soft cover, self-published. About 2 years ago, it was adapted beautifully by Mosaica Press into English, called the Mussaf Prayer. What we're going to discuss right now is this new sefer, new edition, Madura Chadasha of Elchanan, that Ali Zeiss put out, beautifully done, about twice the size of the original softcover Elchanan, Panim Chadashas Mamish. And I have to just give a little shout out. Over these most recent years, I was working with a unique Talmid Chacham in Eretz Yisrael. His name's Yaakov Meir Rottenberg. He's on the editorial staff of Yeshurun. Yeshurun comes out, as you know, twice a year. He's also the grandson of Chaim Symbolist, who's my uncle, so he happens to be my cousin. We have spent many, many hours over the phone discussing a lot of the fine points that we included in the Sefer, both in terms of substance, in terms of style, how to express it. A lot of thought went into how to write it. It had to be my voice, but obviously, you have someone in Eretz Yisrael that can be a little bit better in terms of sometimes the lashon. And Baruch Hashem, I think it came out both in terms of the kamus as well as the eichus. Really, it's really something very, very special.
Okay, so then we got to this book. And as you said, really, Ali Zayas did a beautiful job on this. I was telling you before we started recording that just the physical sefer itself is beautiful. So, there are many svarim today. Some are nicer than others. And I guess everyone has their own opinion about what's nice. But I think even the outside of the sefer, they did a really nice job. And the inside, there's on the right on the front cover, right on the back of the front cover, they did very nice end papers with Tikanta Shabbos and After Yitzhak. On the other end, they did a very nice job on the sefer itself. So,
as you can see as well. No places.
You got everybody included here on the Mussaf. So let's jump right into Mussaf. So we get into Mussaf, and we'll get later on what the difference is between the editions and what the difference is between Mussaf. And we're going to I'll leave the way the sefer structure that the Rabbi of Corfu, his Tam Le Mussaf. So I should mention that even when I posted this originally on the WhatsApp chat, I didn't log it. I just wrote it. It's Tam Le Mussaf. Takonas Shabbos, and right away I got comments. No, it's not Takonas, it's Takanta Shabbos, and right, my mistake. And you even put the nikud that it should be Takanta Shabbos because he's spelled with a kuf, not a kuf. And this is so his sefer will leave to, and there's a fascinating story in and of itself. He published this, and it was a very small sefer, it wasn't redone. He also has a sefer on Eshanis, but we'll get to that. We'll leave that towards the end of the episode as it is in the sefer. So let's start off at the beginning. Why did you decide to, even originally when you wrote the paperback one, and now when you expanded it, write a sefer on Shabbos Mussaf? What's the why?
Right, good question. So first of all, as I said, I put out first on Birchas HaChodesh, which again is something which people don't always know how it came together, the various parts of it, and the Hiratzim being more relatively new, the Hiratzim that the Ashkenazim say, and obviously because I knew that people have a certain affinity for this, and yet they don't always know the backstory. So that's where we started. Anas Miros was a similar thing. Anas Miros is very beautiful, but how many people really pay attention to the language? You know, and they're very difficult words, and they trace themselves back to psukim, and they're strung together. So again, I thought that would be self-contained. Then I thought about Mussaf. This is obviously a larger project. There's a lot more to talk about than just the one poem of Anas Miros or just one little page in the Siddur of Birchas HaChodesh. But again, I felt that Mussaf has a certain mystique to it also. People don't realize. They know it's special. You know, you get to Kedusha, you realize there's something more elevated about it, Shema Yisrael. And those who say Keser understand there's a certain way in Shema Yisrael, Elokeinu. And yet, we don't always understand Tikanta Shabbos. It's like these words, very, very poetic sounding, but what exactly do they mean? Sibisa Perusheha, Sidurin Esacheha. And again, I had worked on it, I had given shiurim on it, and I realized that there's so much depth. And it's to inspire, it's also to inform. I mean, some people find certain ideas inspirational. Other people just need to have the information, the context, the appreciation for, how much is really within every single word. I think along the way, I was even teaching a course in Stern College, and we did liturgy. And again, I noticed the feedback. At that point, I think I already published the soft cover, and then I realized that this is something that they couldn't always appreciate. The students couldn't appreciate the Lashon HaKodesh as much. I had to translate it for them. That's when I got the idea to take it to the next level, to have it done in English. And I think, again, it opens up Tfilas Mussaf in a way that hopefully people have told me that their Mussaf is not the same Mussaf anymore. They dive in and they feel more connected to it. So I think that's that's my goal, really. And obviously, this way, the new sefer is to take it to a whole other level because of the fact that we expanded to include Kedusha. We included the unique sefer that you referred to before. It has a whole different chen, I guess you could describe it as.
Yeah, it's really a beautiful thing that you were able to really put, and we'll talk about the style and the various styles really in your sefer itself that you include in here. Really, every different type. It's not just one; it's all different. Part is really very, very fascinating. Different
multi-dimensional, really very multifaceted.
Right, which is fascinating. But then also to take a sefer from a Kadmon, and a sefer originally published in the early 1600s, and something that wasn't republished, again, very small, not likely to be republished, with a nice introduction there. By the Talmid Chacham that worked on it, editing it, and so that's I think very nice, really. And again, it very related to, it's on Mussaf, so it really went well with your sefer itself, and really gave it to kind of a heintig and a friedik, if you will, a contemporary and an old feel in a sefer, which was very nice. So let's start off with Mussaf. You mentioned before that tefillah comes from. So okay, let's start off with Mussaf. Shabbos Mussaf, the tefillah, the general inyan where it comes from, and then we'll go into the nusach and etc.
Also, just maybe backtrack just because of the real impetus to take this sefer that originally came out in softcover and then in English, and to take it now in this new way. The real inspiration was a special Yid who unfortunately was nifter a little more than a year ago. But you know him, we all know him, Shalom Jacob. He was a unique Talmid Chacham. He used to put out Svarim every year of people who lived many, many years ago, hundreds of years ago, that maybe nobody heard of, and he would reset those Svarim and write a mavel about him. And when we talked about Talmid Mussaf Tikanta Shabbos, I'll talk more about how, he used to do this and how I felt that this was an opportunity. But it was his inspiration, because I actually mentioned to Reb Shalom, why not take this sefer, which we both knew about, and redo it? And he said to me, better. You've written already a sefer on Mussaf Shabbos. Take that sefer, expand it, take another angle, add to it, and then the mitzaref add to that sefer this sefer, and that's really then when he was nifter, I was mekabel b'lineda to finish the sefer around the time of the yard site, which is what happened. So when we talk about Tam Mussaf Tikante Shabbos, I'll give you the rest of that story. So coming to your question, what did you ask again about Mussaf? Just
the general Inyan, where the Tfilas Mussaf comes from. You talk about Psukim, yeah.
So I have both. This is not in the original soft cover, but this is both in the English edition as well as in the new sefer now. A Maimar Psicha be'inyan hamusafin. And what I tried to do here is just frame the Inyan of Tfilas Mussaf and give background to what Korban Mussaf was in the Beis HaMikdash, what the Musafin are, just going back to Chumash, Parshas Pinchas, to explain the Mussaf of Shabbos, the Mussaf of the Yom Tovim, and the basic differences between them. A lot of the words of the Tefillah have to do with the fact that Shabbos Mussaf is different than the others. There's no chatas, it's just 2 kivasim, which also represents a doubling of the Korban Tamid, which also is 2 kivasim per day. So in order to understand that, you have to get a backstory about Mussaf in general, the idea of Nishal Parms Fasenu. So I actually, besides the Maimar Musafin in the beginning, I also included, this was also in the English, I took as a nispach, I took the one of the Old Svarim also, by Menachem Bulunzano, who wrote Or Torah. He wrote a sefer called Avodas Migdash, and within that sefer he has a few pages talking about the Seder Avodas Korban Mussaf, the Beis HaMikdash. So for those who want the technical details of Korban Mussaf, I took that, which is also a Kadmon, and I have a few notes on the bottom. So from this Hagdama, I went from the Torah, Parshas Pinchas, through just again sketching more or less the idea of Lechem HaPanim and the Shnei Basichi Levona, that people don't even always realize exactly what it was, that it's a matir, just like there's a koimetz of a mincha, that's matir the shirayim, there's the askara, you could say, of the mincha called the Lechem HaPanim, and that was brought on the Mizbeach, and these are details, fine details. We didn't go into every last sugya and Shas and Menachos about it, but just to understand where we're coming from. Because again, there are references in the Nusach to the Lechem HaPanim according to different Perushim. What does Nisacheha mean? So you have to understand what exactly was Korban Mussaf in the Beis HaMikdash. But then from there, I segue to understand Tfilas Mussaf as the essence of Tfilas Shabbos. More than any other Tfilah, I think that it's Mussaf that defines the character of the day. We see this in other places as well. Let's see in Rosh Hashanah. We know that the 3 long brachas, the Malchus, the Chonis, and Shofars. So we know we say that in Mussaf. We have the Avodah of Yom Kippurim that we do in Mussaf. And I think that in a way, the uniqueness of Shabbos shines specifically through Tfilas Mussaf. And that's why a lot of the remazim that we bring out from the words Tikante Shabbos and the codes of Tikante Shabbos, all of this reflects the notion of bracha, mangeha la'olam kavod inchalu, tomer chaim zachu. The idea of Shabbos being makor habracha is embedded very much in Tfilas Mussaf. So starting with Korban Mussaf and bringing it down to Tfilas Mussaf to try to convey the flavor of Shabbos and the flavor of Tfilas Mussaf, I think that was a way of framing the whole sefer with the Maimar Psicha, as we call it, in the beginning, before you even start the first parak, which begins the Nusach itself of Tikante Shabbos. And
I think that's where we should go next, talk about the Nusach itself of Tikante Shabbos.
So there were 2 nuschos out there. The Torah brings both of them. The Abudram, and Rishonim, the different Rishonim have different nuschos. Today, though, it's not as well known that there was another nusach at all called the Moshe Tzivisa. It's still, the Teimanim still say it, and I think Spanish Portuguese still says it. But mostly everyone else says Tikante Shabbos. And there's a whole discussion about Tikante Shabbos with a kuf or with a kaf, and the nuances, exactly the difference. At the end of the day, though, they're very similar, because to establish and to create a sense of order and arranging, there's a lot of overlap. But what I do say, and I think it's appropriate now before Pasha Shmos that we're holding now, is an idea that I didn't see anywhere, but I just ran with it because I think it's so beautiful. A lot of the Rishonim point out that the word tikanta, the shorish of that word is, like it says in Pasha Shmos, tochen levenim maskones halevenim, which means a quota, a number. And they all talk about how the remez of Tikante Shabbos, these words, is that there's a numbering idea connected to Shabbos, and call it Lamites Malachis, or call it the seventh day. You count 6, and then Hashem made the seventh day holy. So they associate the idea of numbering and quota with the word Tikante Shabbos, and they trace it to the pasuk in Parshas Shemos. What they don't say, and I think Al Derech HaDrush, this is a beautiful thought, is if you look in the Parshas Shemos and you realize that the context, going back to context of Psukim, and you realize, how beautiful an idea this is. What happens in Parshas Shemos? Moshe Rabbeinu is sent by HaKadosh Baruch Hu on the mission to redeem Klal Yisrael, right, by the sneh. He comes to Paro, and Paro gets upset, and he makes things worse. How does he make things worse? He says the quota has to stay the same. Askones halavenim, tochen levenim stays the same, but you're not going to get the straw provided to you in order to make the bricks. Okay, that's the Pashup shot in the pasuk. But then the Medrash fills in something else. And that is that the Medrash brings out that Moshe Rabbeinu, when he was young, before he ran away, he fled to Midian, he was instrumental in getting Paro to agree to give Klal Yisrael 1 day off every week. And for all those years, from when Moshe ran away until he comes back, at this point in history, he's 80 or so when he comes back, Klal Yisrael had a day off and they were resting, quote unquote. They were resting on Shabbos. The Midrashim talk about what they were doing. They were having Megillos, that they were mishtashea, they were enjoying, they were feeling a connection, and they were getting hope that they're going to get out of Mitzrayim. Paro fell, tichbad ha'avoda. What else did he do besides taking away the straw? He took away Shabbos. The Lashon HaPasuk is interesting. V'yishbatem osam misivlosam could be also a remez that they can't have their rest anymore. So tichbad ha'avoda, he took away Shabbos. So I thought to myself, how beautiful. Tikanta Shabbos, tochen levenim, Shabbos Mussaf is saying, Paro, who has the last laugh? You took away Shabbos. You think you're going to take away Shabbos from Klal Yisrael? We're going to get out of Mitzrayim, and we're going to have Shabbos, Zeicher Yitzias Mitzrayim. That is itself the takeaway of the very first words of the Mussaf. There's a Tosus in Psachim, Navi Psachim, that says that the word Parech has an Adbash counterpart, which adds up to 39. And he says that's also a remes to Zeichel Yitzias Mitzrayim, that we say that Shabbos Kiddush should say Zeichel Yitzias Mitzrayim, because they were resting with Shabbos, we're resting from the 39 melachos that they were doing over the course of the work in Mitzrayim. So here we took Tikanta Shabbos with the Kaf and Tochen Levenim, and we made that the headlines of the Mussaf Shmona Esrei. So that my own drush, I think, is very much anchored in what the Rishonim say when they connect it to that very pasuk.
So you go on and you really go through. I mean, we could go through the whole thing, or you can, we'll pull out some snippets. Obviously, we're not going to go through the whole thing. Someone will have to buy and learn the Sefer. But you go on to explain the Nusach. I mean, you go through Tikanta Shabbos, Ritzitzi Karban Eseh. I'm reading, these are just the head notes. If you look in the expanded Teichen Inyanim, Tzivis Perushem, Sudur Nesachem, and Magnei Le'elam Kavin Michalu, you go through everything. Tamei Achaim Zachuba. You go through, it's out of the whole Mussaf, you really go through. So if you want to just pull out some snippets, you can, but also, you go through some besides for just the explanations, you go to some other, bigger questions, so to speak, where you go, Ozmi Sinai. So you come Ozmi Sinai, right? Say, when was Klal Yisrael Nitztav on Mr. Shabbos? It's not clear, and you go through that. What's the Ozmi Sinai?
So as you know, Nachi, I wrote a sefer. My first sefer that I wrote was called Mitzvah Shabbos, Mimara at Sinai. And again, it was inspired by the fact that I was learning, Tfilas Shabbos, and I came across the kasha that the Rishonim asked, Azmi Sinai nitztavu aleha. And the question is, was it really from Sinai? Didn't Klal Yisrael receive the mitzvah of Shabbos before Sinai? It's interesting how the Rishonim asked the kasha, because we would say, when did they get Shabbos? So you look in Parshas B'Shalach. So in the Psukim explicitly, you only see by the man, which is Klal Yisrael received the man, and Hashem said you get double man on Friday, no man on Shabbos, and you go in Vayish B'Solah B'Yom HaShvi. Chazal have a tradition that already before that in Mara, they were given various mitzvahs, and they were nitztavu on Shabbos, kashet tzivcha, Hashem Elchanan says in Elchanan, kashet tzivcha b'Mara. So one of the mitzvahs in Mara was Shabbos. Interesting is that the Shmuel Eleket, when he raises the question on Azmi Sinai, he says, and even before that in Mitzrayim, which is striking, because Mitzrayim wasn't Hashem's command, it was Paro's decree based on Moshe Rabbeinu, so he even goes back to Mitzrayim. But the question would obviously be, if they got the mitzvah of Shabbos before Sinai, be it in Mara, be it in Olush by the man, so why does it say Azmi Sinai? So there are a range of answers, and in my Sefer, Mitzvah of Shabbos, I'm going through, many, many shittas starting with Rishonim and on, and in my Haggadah as well, on the line of Dayenu, Iu Kervanu, Lefnei Sinai, so the question is also asked, didn't we get Shabbos before the man by Mara? So I discussed that in the Haggadah, I discussed it in my Sefer Mitzvahs Shabbos. So here I have to be Makatzer. So I bring a few different Mahalchim that I mentioned in my Sefer. So the Sheboi Leket suggests, for example, Oz mi Sinai doesn't mean from Sinai, it means prior to Sinai. He quotes a pasuk, Kadem alav mei Oz. It's what he's trying to do is Ki'ilu, making it as if it would say Mei Oz Sinai, Mei Oz, before Sinai. So that's when they got it before Sinai. He says in Mara and in Mitzrayim, he adds also. And others say that it's going in the Kabbanos of Shabbos. And then I bring some of the all different approaches that maybe there was a different level of Shabbos that set in terms of becoming a mitzvah, aspects of the mitzvah that come at different points, and it was only at Sinai that it got the full level of the mitzvah that we know today with Zachas Yom HaShabbos Ukadsha. But again, this became a springboard. The 4 words, Azmisin Stavu Aleh, became an entire section of the Sefer, again, because really this is Torah Shebal Peh. Tefillah, Nusach HaTefillah is limud. I mean, obviously, when you daven, you're focusing on the kavana of the Pirush HaMilos and the connection to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, but really there's so much that goes into the words. And this is a perfect example of how the whole sugya, you could say, of the whole evolution of Mitzvah of Shabbos, how it really lies within these words. So that's obviously its own section, as you mentioned. Yismuchu b'malchuscha is another idea that connects to the question of Simchan Shabbos, which is a sugya in its own right. Is a mitzvah of Shabbos. The Zmiras talk about Simchan Shabbos, but it's not the same level of Simcha. It's not this formal mitzvah of Simcha, yes, but yet at the same time there are Ramazim, there are all kinds of Makoros, a Sifrei, that Yom Simchas and El Shabbos. How do you understand that exactly? There was an old Nusach, V'yismuchu v'cha Yisrael, even on Shabbos. So this is all within Tikant Shabbos. Okay, what else do you want to?
No, I was gonna mention I'm glad you got there. There's differences, as you say, this Sefer tries to encompass both Ashkenaz and Sfard, and there are differences when you say this between Ashkenaz and Sfard. It's something you discuss also, besides for the Makar of Simchan Shabbos. So yeah, and then the Sefer really goes well. Now, next we get to Ati Yitzarta. Ati Yitzarta is, to me, is a very fascinating thing, because many times for a Yom Tiv, or you add in different phrases, you perhaps add a little bit to the Nusach. Here, when it comes Shabbos Rosh Chodesh, we swap out the Nusach and we just go with a totally different Nusach. So, first of all, that's an interesting thing. And then you discuss Ati Yitzarta as well.
So Ati Yitzarta is unique. And one of the nice things about the Sefer is we put in a few charts. So it really helps visually to see some of the parallels between, let's say, Ati Yitzarta and let's say Shalosh Regalim, Ata V'chartanu. It's really a hybrid nusach, Ati Yitzarta. There are parts of the bracha that are the same as Shabbos, a regular Shabbos. There are parts of the nusach bracha that are similar to Yantif, Shalosh Regalim, Havtosanu, Batisabanu, Batitan Lanu, and then there are parts that are completely unique, like the first couple of words, and then there are parts that are similar to a regular Mussaf of Rosh Chodesh during the week. That's the last paragraph. And it's just to be able to understand before anything else, just the interesting hybrid of what you did here in this bracha. And obviously, why did they create a new bracha? Why couldn't they just keep Tikant Shabbos and then merge Rosh Chodesh into that? Why couldn't they keep, let's say, the weekday Mussaf and just go with Shabbos? And the Rishonim talk about it. There are a couple of different explanations and a lot of different ways to address this. Another issue related to this, which I spend a lot of time on as well, which is also a fascinating sugya in its own right, but I believe Baruch Hashem, it really was organized very, very well, is why we omit, at least I say most of us omit, the phrases "Kachina mitzosecha, simchokenu b'soresecha," all of those bakashas that we say typically on Shabbos or Yantif in the final closing paragraph before we end the bracha, and yet you look at the Shabbos Rosh Chodesh in most Sidurim, you won't see Kachenu, you won't see all of that. You'll just see basically the paragraph that you'd say on the Mussaf Rosh Chodesh during the week. And just here and there, you mention Shabbos in the beginning of the paragraph, at the end of the paragraph. But what happened to all those bakashas of Shabbos? So there's a lot that's been written about this and a lot of back and forth. And Baruch Hashem, we were able to organize it in such a way that people can understand. There's a tshuva, the tashbeitz on it, and they have to know how to understand that. But at the end of the day, there are those who still do say it. There's the Nusach of Chabad based on the Balatanya, and it's Aruch HaShulchan also thought that it should be said. But there are a lot of fine details, of course, that those who are in the Sefer, you'll see it's a sugya in its own right. You can give more than one shir just in that very section. Moshe Shapiro has an incredible mahalach and why he thinks that we leave it out. But again, that became also its own Inyan of Shabbos Rosh Chodesh and in the Nusach HaTfilah.
As you mentioned in the beginning, that the Sefer has so many different parts. You mentioned to me that someone told me they don't know where to put it on the shelf. So you get to Perek Daled, and it's in Yonim B'Tfilas Moshe Rosh Chodesh Shechal B'Shabbos, which is if you forget Yal Yava B'Shachris, is it good enough to have a skaris of Rosh Chodesh by Mussaf? So that's like a halacha thing. Now we're like off of explaining it and how, what style you're doing the explanation. Now we're just on to a halacha topic. So really there are a lot of different parts of the Sefer. Really everything related to Mussaf Shabbos is what you included in here. And before we get to that, then we get to the section of Kedusha of Mussaf. And you mentioned, I believe earlier, that was a new section, completely new to here. And Mussaf, Kedusha, obviously we have Keser versus Naritzcha, we have different Kedusha, different Nusach again, the Ashkenaz versus Sfard, and just the overall Inyan of the Kedusha of Mussaf.
Yes, so there's so much here to talk about. Kedusha Rabbah, it has a special name. You see that there's a certain mystique that's connected to Kedusha of Mussaf. First of all, if you say Keser is its own Inyan. Keser is Gematria 620, which is Hashem Melech, Hashem Malach, Hashem Yimlach, Yolam Voed. The Rishonim point this out. You have the idea of Mimkoim Oyifim Rachamim, and the word Makom has its own Ramazin. Makom is a Gematria of 186. If you take the 4 letters of the Shem Havaya and you multiply each letter by itself, so that means Yud, 10 times Yud is 100, and then your Hey, you get 25, and again 25, the second Hey, and the Vav is 36. That also becomes Makom, so there's a lot of depth just to the very word Makom. And so Shema Yisrael, which is in a way a parallel to the Malachim. The Gemara in Chulin talks about how we say 2 words and then we say the Shem Hashem. They say 3 words and the Shem Hashem, so we have that certain advantage over the Malachim. According to many, the uniqueness of Mussaf has to do with the fact that it's not just that we're mitzaref ourselves to the Malachim to be Mekadesh Shem Shemayim, but we are Ki'il doing it on our own. And it's not just tagging on to the Malachim. Again, this is all laid out, and even in terms of the Nimkami and Berachamim, why is it that in Yom Kippur we say this Kedusha Rabbah even in Shachris? We say Kvodim Oli Olam, Nimkami and Berachamim in all the Tfilas, and Shema Yisrael as well. Again, because of the uniqueness of Yom Kippur, we need the Rachamim of Yom Kippur. The Kisei is more elevated. So Rachamim, again, there's a lot here. There's a little Kabbalah here and there as well, which is really above my pay grade, but you couldn't leave it out. You have to relate to it on some level because it's really very much part and parcel of what we're saying. Kvodim Oli Olam, the Inyan itself of the machlokes between, you could say, Balatanya maybe and the Gra, possibly, or maybe they're not really arguing. You can't avoid it completely, so we try to at least make mention of that. Quite honestly, Nusach-wise, you have to know. The Rambam, not everyone has Shema Yisrael. The Rambam didn't have Shema Yisrael in his Kedusha, and some had the word Keser in all the Tfilas. But obviously the mainstream approach is what we know today, and going back to the Rishonim, that there's something unique about Mussaf, that it's Keser, or it's Naritzcha. Naritzcha is also unique. In the Zemer Friday night, Menucha v'Simcha, we have a line that says, Nishmas kochai v'gam naritzach. Kum kra elav yachish l'amsach nishmas kochai v'gam naritzach. What does that mean? It means that you call out to HaKadosh Baruch Hu with Nishmas kochai, which is unique to Shabbos, a tefillah of Nishmas, a very holy tefillah, v'gam naritzach, and also naritzach. Naritzach is a unique type of a hazmana of the shots to the kahal, that we're going to be Mekadesh HaKadosh Baruch Hu, say Kedusha in this manner. So that means that Naritzach also has a uniqueness to it. And as many explain, even Naritzach could have within it the koyach of Keser. It's just not explicitly stated, although not everyone looks at it that way. I quote from Rabbi Yoshe Ber Soloveitchik that he had a very interesting approach where he wanted to say that the difference between Keser and Aritzcha is very much the question of whether we are saying the Kedusha Kilu on our own. When Mekadesh HaKadosh Baruch Hu, he says the Shema Meforash, just like the Malachim do it, we do it independently. That's if you go with Keser. However, if you say Aritzcha, then it's really more like we're tagging on to the Malachim, not doing it independently. And he wants to make Pshat Machokis, Machaber and Ramah. If you can answer for one Kedusha if you're holding in the other one. That's also very fascinating insight. It's hard in a few minutes to summarize so much that's here. I see you smiling, Nachi, but you understand it's you have to learn it and you have to see it and take your time. And there's halachic issues also, Chatzi Pasuk. How do you say Kadosh, Kadosh, Kadosh? And how can you say Ani Hashem Elokeichem at the end? There's also, again, it's there's Nusach, there's Halacha, there's Alul Kabbalah, there's Agada. It's very eclectic in what we try to bring in. We haven't gotten yet to the history either, the Shema Yisrael and the Shas HaShemad, but that's another aspect of this Kedusha. But you tell me where you want to go.
Well, we should get into the Shema Yisrael, I think. But before that, I'll let you go with there. But I just want to mention also for the listeners that really it is everything in here. I don't know if you mentioned where there are a lot of about Girsa and Nusach HaTfilah. So we have, is it Naritzcha and Akdishcha, or is it between Akdishcha and Naritzcha? Forget about it. Is it Keser or not? Even just there's a lot of Nusach. But then, as you mentioned, you get into Kvoidei Mali Olam. So you go, the Makar, and then you go into the Inyan of the Kvoidei Mali Olam, the Mekayim Shel HaKadosh Baruch Hu. So as you see, it's really Pardes, and it's really, but it's even more than that, because not only is it that, it's also, like we said, it's Nusach, and there's Halacha, and there's history. So we'll go to the history. And it's really, again, everything you want to know about Mussaf Shabbos is included in the Sefer. So why don't I talk about Shema Yisrael, about the history?
So the way that it comes out from Rishonim, the Gaonim already, there was a Shas HaShemad, and it's not 100% clear exactly what period we're talking about. And I have a nispach where I bring some different theories about whether, what king was it and what year was it, because there are different points in history that there was a Shas HaShemad, but the basic gist is that they could not call Yisrael, it was not possible to say Shema Yisrael, because they were being patrolled and they couldn't express it. So they had to do something clandestinely, and they would be Mavriya Shema Yisrael in Kedusha, and somehow that, and then eventually, even after the Shema, the Gzeira ended, and this king was miraculously killed, however that happened, all different legends about that. So then they continued to say Shema Yisrael in Mussaf. But what you start noticing, I try to be very painstaking in going through the various Lishonos of the Rishonim and the Gaonim. So what exactly did they do when they were saying Shema Yisrael at the time of the Shas HaShema? They were saying it in this very quiet way, in all the tefillos, in Shachris, in Mussaf. At the end of the day, they left it for Mussaf. Does that mean that it was originally in Mussaf and they left it there? Does it mean that they moved it from Shachris to Mussaf? And the other question is, when they were saying it, what was the agenda? Was the agenda just because they wanted people to remember about Shema Yisrael and the belief in Shema Yisrael? Or did they actually do it as a way of allowing the Kahal to be Yotzei Shema? And then you have to get into another issue, and that is, let's say the Shat said it, would that count for the Tzibur? Because that's a big machlokes. Can you be Yotzei Kriyas Shema with Shemer Ka'oina or not? There's a famous gra, Me'emasai Koirin is a Shema Ba'arvis, which means that you can't be Yotzei with one person. It says, B'shachris, Nevarech Shtayim Lefaneha, the Birchas Kriyas Shema, you can have one person be Motzi the Rabbin, but Shema has to be everyone themselves. That's the Shita of the Abadram is that way, that you have to do your own Kabbalah Malchus Shemaim. Then there are other indications. Machlokes Mishnah Berurah brings both Shitas about it, whether you can be Yotzei. So according to some Rishonim, it comes out that the Shema was said by the Shliach Tzibur, and he was Motzi everybody with the Shema Yisrael. According to others, Abadram is mashma that everyone said it, and how they were Yotzei. So that becomes its own question. Again, how was it done? B'shas Hashmad, and then what changed afterwards, and why Mussaf in particular? again, so you have to go through every single shita, which I quoted with Shona, so you can kind of see for yourself. We added a section called a Hagdama section, just because there's so many things to keep track of. So you'll notice in that parak on Shema Yisrael, I thought it would be only appropriate before diving right into the Rishonim, and the Gaonim, just simply straight to lay out what are the issues. So that's sort of framing the issue. Obviously, there's a close connection between Shema Yisrael and Kedusha. As we noted before, there's a Pikad Rabbi Elchanan about it. But apparently there was this tradition of a Shas HaShemad, and this way of being masked the Nes, and that's maybe why Mussaf was chosen, because we know that the attendance peaks in Mussaf, more people come, the Gemara Rosh Hashanah, right? It's more B'roi V'am at Mussaf, so they wanted people to really get the message about the Hatzalah from this Shas HaShemad, so they moved it to Mussaf. That becomes the Shema Yisrael discussion. Yeah.
And it goes...
Go ahead.
Yeah, no, keep going. And just to explain to the listener that you called the section on Mussaf, Kuntris Kedusha Shal Mussaf, because really it's its own section. And every verse in Kedusha has its own chapter. So Hu Elokeinu is going to get its own one. And then even Hu, you break it up, Hu Avinu, Ani Hashem Elokeichem, you really, and you really split it up, each one, and the pages on each one, and we really could go into it. And just to make the point that the Sefer itself, before we get to the Kuntris, of Rebbe Sefer Kohen of Korfu, the Sefer itself is 300 pages. So just that part of the Sefer itself is really, and again, just on Mussaf Shabbos.
Actually more. It's more like, you take a look, it's actually 350 or closer to 400 maybe, but we are in her.
Yeah. Baruch Hashem. No, I just want to to give the listeners an understanding of how much is it, how many pages there is here in the Sefer.
There is also another inyan of halacha that comes up with Hu Elokeinu, just I'll mention in passing. The old Nusach was not, after you said Shema Yisrael Hashem Hashem Echad, they said Echad Hu Elokeinu, not Hu Elokeinu. And that became a whole controversy. And this takes us to the sugya in Brachis, in the fifth parak, when you talk about saying a word twice, Shema, Shema, B'shas Ketno Yisrael, and it's a question if it's talking about saying one word at a time with a pasuk at a time. Either way, it's a problem. And then this issue came up, and many felt that you can't say the word echad twice because of that issue. And again, it gets discussed in the Sefer as well, whether it's and then you have interesting issues relating to that in other types of tefillas that Derech Agav I discussed. When you say Bani Sfilasi 3 times when you take out the Torah, is that a problem? Yud Gimel Midas 3 times. So there are some people who actually are machmir on that based on the same Gemara. But it all comes from this discussion of Echad Hu Elokeinu, which was the original Nusach apparently, and now more or less it's not said. It's just Hu Elokeinu that we say.
As to be expected with tefillah, there's a lot, and especially you try to incorporate Ashkenaz and Sfarad. There's a lot of nusach going on. Not only nusach, as you mentioned, some of the pshatim and some of the halachic things. And nusach sometimes tied to halacha, but for nusach for a second, which part of the nusach was maybe most surprising to you when you do you even have one that when you started researching and looking at the different nuschos?
I mean, there's so much. It's hard to tell you. There was one thing that jumped out at me. I mean, look, pretty much we know today how we daven. I mean, there's Nusach Ashkenaz, Nusach Sfarad. More or less, most of us are in one camp or the other. So we know what those differences are. Once you start looking at Rishonim, you see that there's a Machzor Vitri that had has a whole different phrase for some of these words. I forget already the exact phrase that it was, but it stood out because no one ever heard of it. So you do see, you could say, out of the box nuschos when you start looking around, but it doesn't really have any practical implication except for the sake of limud. So, I mean, I mention those things, but I don't mention it in the beginning when you have the, for people to look at the nusach. I just have what we know today in most Sidurim. But no, there are definitely, there are all kinds of variations in Nusach HaTfilah, going back to Kat Shabbos, really, with Rav Sadi going, V'amam going, and the Rambam's Nusach HaTfilah, and in Machzor Vitri, you do see a lot of things that didn't quite make it in terms of what we know today, but they're out there, and you start noticing them. Look, with the Cairo Geniza, you find also all kinds of things. I guess this could be a segue to what we're going to talk about, but I'll mention it already in that regard. We're going to talk about Yosef HaKohen Karfo. So he had, he was Machzor Romania which is a certain particular tradition. I know you're into that, Nachi, right? No.
The Nusach Romania, yeah, the Byzantine Nusach. These were not Romania, the country. This is the Greek, the Byzantine Empire, really. The Greek Jews davened this Nusach. I mentioned it on the podcast, and I've mentioned a number of times, but maybe the most famous one that listeners will be familiar with, the Mizrahi was a Romanian Jew. This is again before the Byzantine Empire was conquered by the Turks, and it became Turkey, and then post-expulsion, and ended up becoming Sfarad, and it became Sfaradi because they came from Spain, from Sfarad. But really, before that, that was not. The Nusach Romania is similar, like the Byzantines were from Romans, so it was similar to the Roman Nusach, which is his own Nusach, which is similar to Ashkenaz, really, if you trace it back. Just again, painting with a broad brush. Generally speaking, that's what it would be. So yes, he had the Romano Nusach, and so kind of
one thing that stood out when I first counted this. This was, he mentions, in part of his Sefer, he mentions the Chasima, because usually these changes are not in the Chasima. Usually these changes are within the text of the Bracha itself. The Chasima, we don't usually find variants today. He had a Nusach, Hapori Sukas Shamoina Kol Moisav Al Yerushalayim Ir HaKodesh. That's how he concluded the Bracha on Friday night. So that is interesting that he had those extra few words, and just that was his Nusach. But okay, if you want to talk about this whole story.
Yeah, so let's go to that Kudshas Tam the Mussaf Tekanta Shabbos. But I want to, before I dive into that Sefer, and there's a lot to talk about there, I do want to ask you, you mentioned Reb Shalom Jacob and his connection and how that's how you decided to include the Sefer. I know we actually spoke about this before you started doing this. You called me, was it 2 years ago? I remember we talked about this idea of including this, and I thought it was a fabulous idea, and I do think it's a really, as a proponent of reprinting old Sfarim that, nicely, that haven't been redone, that no one's looking to print. I mean, there's someone from Corfu for the Romanian community, and again, very small Sefer. I thought it was a great idea, and I'm very happy to see that it came to be. And I mentioned he also wrote Moshe's Kel as the name of a Sefer on Elchanan. But so how exactly did this? Well, how did Rav Shalom's idea? How did this come to be?
Rav Shalom, I know Rav Shalom for many years, and he was such a gracious person. And very unique Talmid Chacham. I spoke to my shir about him when he was Nifter Nebuch, and just so people should know such a person. He used to put out Sfarim. He must have put out well over 20, 25 Sfarim, maybe more. I lost count, but it came out every year. There was another Sefer of a Kadmon. Just recently, there's a machon called it's to put out the Ksavim of Asfir Shkuzinski, who was a Rav in Omaha, Nebraska, for many, many years. He was a cousin of Chaim Oizer, and he was a Goyin HaGoyinim, and he left tremendous amount of Ksavim. So they hope to put out more and more. They just recently put out on Hilchas Nida, an incredible Sefer, and that was a big tribute to Rav Shalom, because that just came out not too long ago. And they have many more things that they could write on, Shubas Harash and others. He was very into that particular Gadol and his Ksavim, but he was really into publishing Sfarim from way, way back, going back hundreds of years, and he would always do it meticulously. He would research the person, and he had people also who would help in Eretz Yisrael, help, to organize it, put it all together. He had contacts all over, and literally every year came out, there'd be a Sefer that would come out. He would send me typically the Sefer with an inscription, and sometimes he wanted me to bring Rav Shachter, Shlita, a copy, and others, because he felt that people who would appreciate this Sfarim should have them. And it was really just for the covet of these people, these Gedolim who nobody remembers. Okay, so Baruch Hashem, we had a good relationship. And he encouraged me over the years with Sfarim that I've written. So Umaisa, we talk, and it turns out, remember when I gave I wrote my Sefer on An's Miras, so he actually encouraged me to reach out to Rav Schlesinger from Strasbourg. That's Yisrael David Schlesinger's father. Rabbi Yisrael Schlesinger is the Rav in Muncie, where Shalom davened over the years. They were very, very close. And so his father, Shalom, also was very close with. He used to always write Haskamas for all of Rav Shalom's Sfarim. And he made a connection at that point for him to write an Haskama for Anim Zmiros. And then subsequently, of course, he wrote Haskama for this new edition of the Elchanan. And I said to Rav Shalom one time, we used to chat, this Sefer, like you look at the Hebrew books or Eitzah Chachma, you can barely read it. Now, I knew about it because I quoted it in the Elchanan, both the Hebrew and the English, in the earlier edition, because it's interesting. Some of the Pirushim were more or less what the Rishonim say, the Kolba, others, the Shavoi Leket. He didn't tell you who he's taking it from. Some ideas were unique. And okay, so I figured, another aspect of Tikkunt Shabbos, so I brought it in. But I said to myself, this Sefer, you can barely read it. It's very, very hard to read. Take the Sefer and do what you're doing with everything else. This was about 2 years ago. And he said to me, and this is really to tell you what kind of a person he was. He said to me, no, I don't need to do it. You wrote a Sefer on Mussaf Shabbos. This is around the time that the English book came out. Take your Hebrew, the original paperback, expand it, add a new section, and then take the Sefer and you'll reprint it, do it the way I do it, with a mavai about the mechaber and with notes on the bottom. I said, I have no experience in this. He says, I'll connect you with someone in Eretz Yisrael who does this kind of work. And so it was. This is going back a couple of years. And that person worked on, I got to meet him, actually, it was in Eretz Yisrael that summer, a couple of years ago. And he did this. He actually took the Sefer, he had it reset. He did a whole research on the person of Yosef Cohen Mikrofel, who talk about him in his story. And he had my Sefer, the Lashon HaKodesh paperback, so it was helpful to him. So he knew when Rabbi Yosef Cohen Mikrofel was quoting something from a Rishon, he would be able to right away know because he had my Sefer. So he put this together, and it sat, And I had notes on Kedusha that I was, whenever, I just sort of had in the back of my head, okay, one day we'll have this and my notes on Kedusha, and we'll do what Rav Shalom suggested I do. Nebuch, unfortunately, Rav Shalom tragically was nifter in Elul Tafshin Pei Gimel, right before Rosh Hashanah, a little more than a year ago. And it was at that time I said, okay, this is Min HaShamayim, I need to get on this. And more or less that year, Tafshin Pei Dalid, this was a project that myself and Rav Yaakov Bratenberg in Eretz Yisrael, we went back to the Kedusha notes. I already had what Rav Kapushnik in Eretz Yisrael, he's the one that worked on it. He already had done his work, but we had to take this whole Kuntres Kedusha and put it together. So, meanwhile, the Sefer was dedicated to Rav Shalom. Unfortunately, I lost my father this year, Tafshin Pei Daled, right before Shavuos, so my Sadat became also a big Hakdash in the Sefer, and turns out that Schlesinger from Strasbourg, his wife was Nifter, so Mamela, we added that as well. So in his Haskama, he mentions the three neshamos that the Sefer is Mugdash to, and I believe that it's a schus of everybody that the Sefer came out as it did. So to talk about Yosef Cohen Mikrofel is just its own story. We talked about, in the Mava, you'll see a bit about the Kehila in Karfo. He was born in around 1540, a little before that, at the end of the Shnas Haresh, as they say. The Radach was there in Karfo before that. It doesn't tell you who he learned from, but it does talk about how he had a following, and he had a lot of people coming to hear his shiurim. After the burning of the Talmud, of the Gemara in Venice, what year was it, Nachi?
So those were in the 1550s, in the early 1550s. I mean, each community, then it spread out throughout Italy. They all suffered.
He had to migrate to Constantinople, and then again he had a following. Here's a story. It's a beautiful story. This of Yosef Cohen Mikrofel, and there's a section here in the Mavai that Rabbi Kapushnik gave it a heading, Yosef Chide V'Sa'aretz. We know that Yosef loved Eretz Yisrael. So this is of Yosef Cohen Mikrofel. He's getting older, and he suddenly had a tremendous cheshek to go move to Eretz Yisrael. The problem is he didn't have the means. He couldn't afford to go. So one day he sees people davening Hoshanis and Sukkos from whatever the Nusach Romania was, that was his origin. And he saw that they're saying words like parrots, they don't know what they're saying. He said, let me take this and explain it based on the Farshim, whatever I can add on my own. And the money that I'll make from selling this Sefer, Moshe Kale, I'll be able to now afford going to move to Eretz Yisrael. So what happens? He publishes the Sefer, Moshe Kale. He starts trying to sell it in the area where he lives. Nobody wants to buy it. He gets very disappointed. So he has to go out to other kehilos to try to sell the sefer. And by that point, Baruch Hashem, enough people realize that it's a mitzvah to help this person out. So he was able to sell enough copies to be able to raise money now to go on the boat to Eretz Yisrael. Okay, so now comes the story. And he goes to Eretz Yisrael. On the way, in the boat, and the details are described here, the boat is attacked by pirates, and they take away everything that he owned, including his Sfarim and his money, because he did very well. Apparently, he had enough money now. And by Nisim, he was able to save himself and 5 others, Canaan, that were in this big ship, and they got to another boat, and they more or less went back to where they came from. One of them didn't survive at the end, but he meanwhile saved them at that point. He did not despair. He continues without anything to Eretz Yisrael. Now, this is from the Mavli, but in his Akdama, he has a very beautiful word, because he was a Talmid Chacham, so he finds a way to bring out an idea of Musar as he's describing his own situation, that he's going to Eretz Yisrael with basically nothing. He lost everything, and the biggest problem was that he lost his Svarim and his money, but he wanted to go to Eretz Yisrael so much. So he brings a pasuk in Eov, Kapitel Lamed Aleph, Ochal piti levadi v'lo ochal yasel mimena. And it says, V'ochal mikol, in Parshas Toldos by Yitzchak. So there's V'ochal piti levadi, V'ochal mikol. And he brings a remes. He says, the Musar is a person could just have bread. That's it. And that should be for him, V'ochal mikol, as if he had all the Tanugei Ha'olam, because that should be enough for you, even if that's all you have. That was the first idea. Then he goes and takes it another level, and he says, if you're going to be V'ochal mikol, you're going to eat all the Tanugei Olam Hazeh, then you're not going to be able to give tzedakah. So you're going to be V'ochal piti levadi, v'lo ochal yasel mimena. The poor, the orphans are not going to get to eat because you're eating everything for yourself. And he goes on with that. V'ochal mikol is with a kametz. So you have to be able to be mekametz. You have to eat less. Otherwise, it's going to be a problem. That's the chus of tzedakah. So this is all in his own Hagdama. Okay, back to the story. So he goes to Eretz Yisrael. He goes to Tzfat. Now, mind you, the person of Kapushnik who worked on this, because I visited him, he lives right outside of Tzfat. He lives in Chatzor HaGlilit in the north. So, he connects with the whole story. In Tzfat, Rav Yosef HaKohen Mikarfo writes this sefer, Tam the Mussaf Tikanta Shabbos, which is a parish on Tikanta Shabbos. And what does he write on the Shabbat? He writes, I'm writing the Sefer as a Hodah to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, who saved me from the pirates at sea. And here's the thing. He wants it to get printed, right? He's writing it in Tzfat. He sends it to his son to print it. The printing comes out terrible. So he sees it's not going to happen unless I leave Eretz Yisrael to oversee the printing in Venice. So after he makes the trip with Mesiras Nefesh to Eretz Yisrael, he leaves Eretz Yisrael to oversee the printing of this Sefer. And then he writes at the end of the Sefer, at the end of his Hakdama, at the end of the Sefer, that Hashem should help me, that I should be able to go back to Eretz Yisrael, because he had to leave to publish the Sefer, to oversee the publication. So he writes at the end of his Hakdama, Esa Kappa El Hashem, whoever will bless anyone who's going to buy this small little Sefer, Chibur HaKatan Hazeh, Yisa V'racha Me'es Hashem, Sheyachzik B'yadi Lagos Eretz HaKadosha V'lo Eitze Mimena Oid. That it should help me to go back, that I shouldn't have to leave again. B'yikuyam Banu Nevuas Lecharia Od Yesh V'skenos B'chovis Yerushalayim Ish Mishanto B'yada Mirav Yamim Amen Kenyas Hashem. That's he writes at the end of the Hakdama, and he does it again at the end of the Sefer as well. V'yaleini shenes le'eretz hakadosha v'sham tarbe ma'odi v'hoini v'yasmei alay tzari v'yagoni amen ken yiratzen. So we don't know historically if he actually got to return to Israel. We don't know the end of the story. So, but meanwhile, the schus, I talk about Rav Shalom's schus and everyone else who was involved, Kol HaMesayim with Dvar Mitzvah, but to me, the biggest schus for the Sefer's Hatzlacha is of Yosef HaKohen Mikarfel, because he's obscure gadol that no one ever heard of, really. And that you see his uniqueness coming through, and his mysterious nefesh for Eretz Yisrael, and that's why I write. Just because of the matzah today, as we know, in my own Hakdama, I write that it should be a schus for Achenu Kol Beis Yisrael, the Frat in Eretz Yisrael, who are going through such difficult times. It should be a schus for them that Hashem Kashim Motzi them. It's really the schus. You never know how schusim can come many years later and help us all out. So that's the last. The last chelik in terms of the sefer within the sefer, the story within the story.
Amen. And I want to say I had a couple of things. So Corfu is an island. Again, many listeners may be familiar with it because of Esrogim, the whole Corfu Esrog thing. And I've talked about Corfu on the podcast in the past. But what's so fascinating is you mentioned the story, which is a wild story. The first first edition was printed in somewhere near Constantinople in Turkey, and it was terrible. I don't think we have any copies surviving. We don't know anything about it. But then he printed it in Venice, as you said. But what's fascinating is, first of all, so I don't mention in his Hakdama here, there's very interesting, he gives a lot of biographical information in the Hakdama to Moshe Kel, and that's a sefer on Hashanis, and in his sefer here on the Talmud Mussaf to Kanta Shabbos. But what he says is, and he's always talking about Eretz Yisrael, Eretz HaKadoshah, and he talks about it, and obviously you can see his love for Eretz Yisrael. But one thing, first of all, just to mention what he says about Elchanan, I thought this was a very nice quote. He says, and he talks about that he had to move around, and he was traveling around, and he says, Shemayim Edi, Visahadi, and he had many issues, many different things. He talks about it going back, and he says, why did he decide to do this? He says, first of all, he decided to publish a sefer on Hashanis. V'chibarti pirush Hashanis anhagas b'kal kodesh Romania. Why? V'karasi Moshe Kel, shtei tshuis. Achas Allah, echad alai, ve'echad lebachurim, bachurei chemed. So one for the bach, what bachrim? So he says why? Asher bizman chagzim chaseinu, one sukkis, menagnim, benoyam, everybody sings Hashanis, ubekoil rov, ubekoil arev. Tzoyakim v'oimrim Hashana. Koishata elim beludimach, b'tzeis chadiyashimach. But no one knows what they're talking about, right? Unfortunately, still today. But he says Rabbi Yosef, even lo yodu v'lo yavinu, masha yoim reich Hashem, Hashem going to save you. You have no idea what you're saying. He quotes Yirmiyah Yud Beis Ches, and he says, you don't even know what you're talking about. I thought for the schus of the Bachrim, L'zakis es atzmi. Unfortunately, nothing worked. I had these two great ideas, and guess what? It flopped. You see that novel that he's writing here in the Akdam of the Sefer. He says, "Ki achar shetarachti bezeyas apiu pezarti kalamoyes latzvos." This is Elchanan. This is what you mentioned, and he said, "I spent the money. Lo yisfakti lachalka bekilas didn't work. Ki zeh hayoyim rebekoy v'zeh rebekoy." What are that excuses? Ad she'utrachti leilech leretz acheres limkur mashen asharti biyadi. I had to go sell it. There's Rani Akel Yisbarach v'lachti ber Candia. Candia is another island. We've discussed Candia in the past in the podcast. She'yesham kilas Romania. Borodis Rhodes is a Greek island. Again, it continues on. So first of all, there's just a lot, for those that aren't familiar, in a lot of old Sfarim, Haskama or the Hakdama, you can find a lot of really fascinating historical information, biographical information about the author. And you really see the way Rabbi Yosef is really telling you. You can get a feel for the Mechaber himself, for his personality, and you get to really read that about it. So then he gives the whole story, which you mentioned with the pirates. He gives the crazy story. And he talks about that, and then he really continues, and then he talks about he lost his Sfarim. I thought that was also something that jumped out to me. What did he care about? He got caught by pirates. Everything's gone. Imagine you get captured and you lose everything, right? Yeah. And you have to just jump out. Or we're seeing now unfortunately the fires, right? We're seeing fires in Los Angeles. We're talking about now, and in California. I think people just homes burning up. Everything. What bothered Rabbi Yosef? Yes. His Sfarim, that's what bothered him. And in those days,
he says,
right? His Sfarim.
Yeah.
Imagine Sfarim in those days. So this is in the beginning of the age of print, the first real century of print. It's still very expensive to get Sfarim. And he brings about his Sfarim. He says he lost everything. Sholos nichsi v'halchu shevi lefnei tzar kaspi v'zavi aritzi pritzim bazu ishle el's money arkezim leim kol toiv lachem v'ayinu. They took everything. Sifrik is apirim yikarim. They were like sapphires. Bezuye buzzim shalol shalom. Chaval al da'avdim ve'ena mishtachin v'niskayim biviyitin l'shevi uzoy v'tefaret biyad sar. Quotes to him. Ve'eni boichum esabel. He says, and I don't cry and I don't sit and I don't mourn anything. All his money, his possessions, everything. Ella al sifri, my svarim.
40 years.
And I think this means all his farm, not only his personal farm, things he owns. I didn't want to sell them. I love them like myself. He says, I'm naked, nothing. I feel like a blind person in the darkness. If there's a sickness, illness, why again his svarim? They went in the village. It's amazing how he writes, and you really see it comes through how broken he is. He lost his svarim. And again, these are personal svarim, maybe this svarim that he wrote as well, manuscripts he's referring to his own thing. He says, Alakol, but Alakol, he's gadol, v'yiskadesh, shmoy, she'asa imi nisim, and iflosh, that's saying him the other, because of course I have to thank the Eibishter. V'asa imi, mishal l'shah, harbe Yeshua, v'chal anashim, sh'gati chazol hem, mishal makaymoy, v'ani nasi el. He goes on, and keeps going. First of all, again, it's a really fascinating introduction here. And then he goes back to the Sefer and why he wrote the Sefer, and he talks about the Sefer, etc. And there's other things that are written in here. He talks about the Sefer, the issues with the printing, and he had to go print it. And then there's the Sefer itself. I don't know, Rabbi Adler, if you want to talk about something in the Sefer, just a little bit. It's again a very small Sefer. I think in the new edition here, which has some footnotes, but the new edition, it's so including the introduction. It's 20 pages, about 20 pages, a very, very small sefer. He wrote this almost really a kuntras. You hear about a kuntras, it really was a small, and he went through explaining the.
He went through. So a lot of what he says, you find in Rishonim, but there are some interesting tweaks. Like there's a lot of questions about mangel covered in chalu. Are we talking about covered in this world? Are we talking about covered in the next world? And I bring different Rishonim on each side of it, and he comes and says it's both. And he says it depends. If your Oinik Shabbos is a Gashmias Oinik Shabbos, so that you're guaranteed schar in this world. So then it would be, Tomer Chaim Zachu and Kavod Yinchal will be in this world. But if you put your Oinik Shabbos into Dvarim Ruchniim, then the schar is going to be in a Ruchnius type of a way. And he stresses a lot that the Oinik Shabbos should make sure to include learning Torah. He says you can't be Yosei by doing it before you daven, but you have to do it after your meal. And Mincha time is very, that brings from the Zohar, that's time that we don't bitul beis hamedrash, so you have to do it between after your meal and the later afternoon. So he stresses about, he talks about she'erksus of oina, and he says oina doesn't just mean the oina that we imagine, kipshutai, which is the physical tainug, but oina means an oina of kvisitim Torah. So that's an interesting way that he brings out the importance of being ma'anik Shabbos in a way of ruchnius. He also says something interesting, which is a little bit chassidish. He talks about the idea of verbally designating food to be l'kavod Shabbos. You talk about, Chaska l'kavod Shabbos, right? This famous story. The idea that you say something kavod Shabbos, he says it gives kedusha to the food, and that's why he says don't eat too much of it before Shabbos. A little bit to taste, one thing, but you don't want to. It's like he calls it, you're being paygame in the food of Shabbos if you eat the Shabbos food on Erev Shabbos, because by being magdish the food, so to speak, he says you're giving it chalal of kedusha. I think was his lashon. It's an interesting. I didn't bring it in the actual sefer that word, but that's something that he actually mentions as well. There are very interesting ideas. You can see his Yiras Shamayim dripping from his words, and a little, his Bekias and Tanakh that come through the words, and his love for Eretz Yisrael, obviously, and the love for Torah, the love for Shabbos. And again, it's a small contrast, but it really conveys a lot. You feel a connection to the Messiah when you read, something like this from published 1604, in Venice. You realize, we're part of an Am Segula that goes back, Dairi Dairis. It's everyone in their own way, but we're Mamshech, that Messiah, all of us. So,
it's beautiful that you included it. As you mentioned, it should be a schos for the three three people that were nifter, and Reb Shalom was most instrumental in this, so definitely should be a schus for him. And you mentioned Shir Skrzynski, and the Sefer Nida was just published, and they are indeed publishing more Svarim, and he published so many Svarim, really beautiful editions, and I know the family is still working, I think, on publishing more. I know they've rolled out a website, the Reb Shalom Jacob Foundation, and he had a massive library. He's a massive collector, so definitely. I said that. I think I said this on a different episode, but I'll say it here. I was in contact with him via email. I think we spoke once even on the phone. He agreed. I had to convince him. He agreed to come on the podcast, and he was going to talk about his many. He was just he knew so much, and unfortunately, it never didn't come to be. So we weren't zeicha to that, but. He was, again, I'm sure people have seen this farm. They have this distinct brown cover. They all look the same, whatever size they are. They all have the same cover. So if you've seen any of them, perhaps there's a number of Svarim. Mainly obscure. They were mostly obscure Svarim that he was looking to rescue from obscurity is what he was interested in doing. These Svarim like this. Yeah, so here it's really amazing because you put it together with your Sefer on Mussaf. So you have, again, Hainti going through everything, and you have this old Sefer of a Kadman that was forgotten and unknown. You can read about, again, you can read the little biography, you can read the introduction, and you can read the Sefer itself. So in closing,
it's a bit as well, Nachi. That's also worth. People want to just get a sense of who people are when they lived. I think it's also kedai. I did it in the English and I did it here because you quote a lot of different svarim, siddur this, siddur that, and also rishonim and samachronim, and just have a sense of where they fit within history. I think short, like usually a line or two, but just for the few pages, I think it's also helpful at the end.
Yeah, very nice bibliography. That's something that a lot of Sfarim like this, they're quoting many different sources, especially on Tefillah. So you have sources that maybe readers are not familiar with, but here you tell them who it is. So a couple final questions for you. One, I mentioned this earlier that we would get to this, which is the English, the Mussaf prayer, the one published by Mosaic Press. What's the difference? If somebody says, well, I have two options, I can buy the Hebrew, of course you have this Kuntris, but what's the difference in the two? Which one should I go with? What's the difference?
Obviously, there's a lot of overlap, but there's also obviously people who would appreciate more one versus the other. This Sefer in Lashon HaKodesh is a little overwhelming in a certain sense because there's really a lot of more material, both in terms of the new material and even the old material. I have more footnotes, and there are things that I added. So, you want something a little more, more like you could say user-friendly in a way not to be overwhelmed. Also, the Lashon HaKodesh sometimes can be a barrier for some people. So in that way, I think you can get the basic information on Tikkun Shabbos at the Yitzharta presented in English. I think for some people that's an easier read, even though you still have to read it and learn it. It's not like, over the chont. It's like you need to learn it, but you can learn it at a certain pace and you can more or less gain the insights and the information. But I think that works for some people. For people who are more inclined to really delve into something more be'iyun, people who are more, trained to learn Lashon HaKodesh Svarim, people who want to get into the Kedusha part, which obviously didn't discuss in the English, and obviously this whole other kuntris that we brought in. So obviously that's where the new Madura is really going to be more appreciated. Each one has its own, milas. They're both good. You have to know. Look, I know someone bought for me recently the Mussaf prayer for a mitzvah present. I've given it for a few times for mitzvah presents because you're not going to give this for a 13-year-old. They're not going to be able to, the Lashon HaKodesh, they won't really be able to appreciate it, maybe a few years from now. But the English, I think they can manage with, and I think it's good for a younger age. People who want the English, I think, will benefit from the English. Those who want a little more, more information and more of a safer type of an Indian. So that's where I think this is more content-wise, certainly much more here. But Baruch Hashem, I think each one has its own chen, its own maila. The main thing is we should dive in with appreciation of what we're saying, understanding that there's so much that goes into every phrase, every word of tefillah, and to be able to appreciate that. And as I mentioned, even in the introduction to the English, the goal is not just to inspire for sure. There's a lot of things that can mechazik us in terms of appreciating Shabbos, but also to inform. I think informing is important because to understand something, even if it's just intellectually, it also, memela, it trickles down because you understand what you're saying, you appreciate where it's coming from, words that come from different places. You have other ways that you'll be able to appreciate it in a different context as well. When you know that wouldn't even discuss the whole Tashrak idea, that the remez of Geula, that's in both Svarim. I mean, just the idea that you could take the Rashi Tevis of the backwards Aleph base and bring out all kinds of remuzim about the Geula, just fascinating in its own way. And people hear that for the first time, and it's like, opens up like a window to thinking about tefillah in a different way. So, Inachi, what struck you? I mean,
it all did. I think what you said, just looking at the Teichen and Yanim, where you have a short one and then you have a long, bigger Teichen and Yanim in the beginning, when the index, and I think that the table of contents, if you will, I think just seeing all that, how much there is on tefillah, just on Mussaf. This is a sefer just on Mussaf Shabbos. And again, it's pshat, and whether that's drush pshat, or a little soid, or a little remez, or whatever that is. And then you have halacha, and then you have also, and nusach, so much nusach, also the difference, so many variations in our nusach. Ashkenaz versus Sfarad, of course, everyone's familiar with, but then even just variations in the nusach itself, and how we changed so much from the times of the Rishonim, and the differences, and why that changed, and the different pshatim and that you went through, I think was so fascinating to see in that in and of itself. And like Rabbi kind of Korfu said, we was trying to do by the Elchanan, to get people to understand what you're saying when you say something, when you're running around singing or whatever it is, to understand what it is that we're saying, what it is we're davening for. I think that the Sefer hopefully accomplishes that. And then, you mentioned, we there's so many things that we miss. I'm sure we missed so much more. The Sefer is everything all together. The Sefer is, almost 500 pages? I mean, it's a big Sefer. It's a very big Sefer. There's a lot of pages, a lot here. So I will put a link in the show's notes to those interested in purchasing the Hebrew and those interested in purchasing the English. They're in Sfarim stores, bookstores. Mosaic Press has the English. The Hebrew was not to Ali Zayis. There's a link to Ali Zayis' website. You can buy it there. And again, you can buy it in local Sfarim stores. But I will link to it for those interested in checking it out. And
people have any ha'aris, Adler, but the idea is hopefully to create a feeling that people could take it to another level. There's so much more that we could have said also, and people can Mussaf v'hailech. So
so you have your email is in the Sefer, but Rabbi Adler@gmail.com, RabbiEadler@gmail. If anyone has ha'aris, they can send to you, or if they sent it to me, I'll pass it along to you. If anyone has any comments or ha'aris, and thank you, Rabbi Adler, for joining me on the podcast once again.
Thank you. It was a pleasure.